Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 48. By the time that most of you are listening to this, I will either be at Tankfest or just home from Tankfest. I'm recording this just before I go to Tankfest for obvious reasons, because I doubt anyone wants to listen to me trying to answer naval history questions while an 80-ton tank goes running past in the background, shaking the ground and spraying us all with dirt and dust. So, hence the recording in the slightly more confined but slightly quieter confines of this recording area. Anyway, as time is short due to the fact that 2 of my normal recording days are going to be occupied either travelling to Tankfest or being at Tankfest, this particular episode of the Drydock will end up being somewhat shorter and more abbreviated than normal, unfortunately. Hopefully I should be able to make that up with, well, the fact that the Patreon Q&A Drydock episode next weekend is probably going to be substantial given the number of questions that people have asked. So there is that. So for the sake of actually getting you a Drydock this week, I am just going to answer a bunch of Discord questions. Regular service, obviously, in terms of answering questions and giving sources for specific videos, will be resumed next week, and then regular Drydock episodes obviously also resuming week after once the Patreon episode is done. So with that said, let's get on to some of those Discord questions. Tamron asks, almost all battleships ever produced have turrets that don't fully cover the tops of their barbettes, and this leaves some exposed areas that must be plated with armour. Bismarck as an example, or King George V, for the front of the barbette instead of the sides. I'm guessing this was done for reasons of weight, as small turrets need less armour, but did anyone consider exposed barbette roofs to be a design flaw? What stops enemy shells or armour-piercing bombs from simply punching through the relatively thin roof and directly into the magazine? So you can see from the picture above that yes, there was a portion of King George V's barbette that was exposed in front of the forward quad 14-inch mount, and as you can see here, these are the turrets of USS Arizona, and you can see that the turret was significantly smaller than barbette, but they'd flared the armour out in a kind of skirt to try and cover a lot of the exposed barbette roof. And here on Bismarck you can see that at the sides of the turret there was an exposed part of the barbette roof as well. So, as you might imagine, some navies did consider this a design flaw when a significant portion of the barbette was exposed, so like the Americans with the Arizona, they would try and cover some of that exposed barbette roof by flaring the armour plate. However, in terms of other navies, such as the Kriegsmarine or the Royal Navy or various other navies that all had this issue, in terms of what stops the shells or bombs from simply punching through into the magazine, 2 factors. One is that, statistically speaking, the amount of exposed space is phenomenally low. And bear in mind that a bomb or a shell that's going to hit something there is probably wider than that gap, except for maybe with the front of King George V's turrets, and is therefore likely to fetch up or at least skim across the armour plating of the turret itself. Secondly, because of the very small surface area exposed, it's phenomenally unlikely in purely mathematical terms that a shell is actually going to hit there, even with long-distance fire. At close-range action, it's just not going to happen, basically. A shell that came in shallow enough to actually worry about significantly going through the barbette roof armour would already have shredded part of itself on the top of the barbette itself. And if it's coming in from a very high angle, again, it's just a simple matter of statistical mathematics that the odds of a shell coming in at precisely the right angle to drop in that tiny little space without hitting anything else that might set it off or knock it off course on the way in is effectively negligible, although it must be said, obviously, in naval warfare, effectively negligible chances do crop up quite a bit more often than you might otherwise think. The other thing you can consider, which, as you can see above, is that it's not a direct path straight down to the magazine. If you manage to somehow get a shell or bomb through that little space through the barbette roof, the projectile is going to end up in the working chamber directly underneath the turret. Now, a shell or bomb going off in this chamber is not necessarily a good thing, not by a long shot. However, if you've got the flash protection in place, BT, then you should still be safe from a magazine explosion, because the flash of the explosion We'll have to translate horizontally across to that hoist lift you can see there, and then it will have to go down through all the flash protection doors down to the magazine, which hopefully it should not do. So, with all that in mind, the short answer, taking that into context, is that yes, where large amounts of barbette roof was exposed, then various navies did take design measures to try and cover it, and where there were only very small amounts of barbette roof exposed, it was basically a trade-off between statistical unlikelihood and interference by other parts of the ship, which was relied on to keep the ship safe. Drylander asks, what are the little wings you sometimes see on submarines? So these are called hydroplanes, and they are used to control the pitch of a submarine when it is underwater. And by calling them little wings, you're not exactly wrong. They don't function precisely like the wings of an aircraft, which are more there to keep an aircraft in the air through lift, and obviously a submarine controls its relative buoyancy via ballast tanks. The hydroplanes are mainly there to act more like the tailplane on an aircraft, which is so to keep it stable and, as I say, to change its relative attitude, so whether it's going to pitch up, pitch down, or stay level. Although it can have a certain degree of lift capability, despite their small size, purely because water is 1,000 times denser than air, roughly, and so the amount of water deflected by a hydroplane that's angled up or down can actually either force a submarine that has positive buoyancy under the water, if the positive buoyancy isn't too much, or conversely bring a submarine that has negative buoyancy, say like if it's been depth charged, to the surface, again assuming that the negative buoyancy isn't too great. As for why you only sometimes see them, well, as you can see on this example, the hydroplanes are mounted at the bow. Other navies mount the hydroplanes on the sail, which confusingly is not in fact a sail. It's what we would otherwise call the conning tower, i.e. the big thing that sticks out the middle of the submarine. It depends on naval design tradition and naval practice. Hydroplanes at the bow obviously less vulnerable to being damaged if they're going up, if the sub is going to come up through the ice in, say, the Arctic Ocean. But hydroplanes on the conning tower act more closely to the submarine's center of moment, which can make them more efficient in certain circumstances and less efficient in others. Also, there's a lot of stuff to do with flow noise over the submarine's hull. And turbulence generated in the water. So it's a very long and complicated series of design choices, and half of the details are probably horribly classified. As getting back to why you don't necessarily see them all the time, some hydroplanes can either be retracted into the hull or folded away flush against the hull or the sail. So occasionally when you'll see a submarine on the surface, they may have the hydroplanes retracted or folded, so you might not see them at a distance. Or alternatively, for some subs, if the hydroplanes are mounted slightly lower on the hull, they may be surfaced in the manner of this submarine, but the hydroplanes themselves may still be below the surface. Hobbyist Contrarian asks, what do you think would have happened if it had come down to a naval battle at Ceylon? So this is 1942, and one little known fact about the Indian Ocean raid is it very, very nearly became rather embarrassing for the Japanese, as Carrier Division 2, which was made up of Soryu and Hiryu, were actually on a course during the Indian Ocean raid shortly after the raid on Ceylon that would have put them basically coming dead at Somerville's own forces as sunset arrived, which is obviously not the best time to be flying carrier aircraft, but the perfect time for the nighttime trained Royal Navy to enact a rather bloody vengeance for the actual air raid on Ceylon. So that was a missed opportunity caused by Somerville changing course based on other intelligence, which turned out to be slightly wrong. But yeah, we came within about 2 or 3 hours of 5 British battleships executing 2 Japanese carriers in a similar, if somewhat more brutal fashion to what Scharnhorst and Gneisenau did to Glorious, but nevertheless. This is one of those scenarios that could literally go either way to an extreme degree. The Japanese have more and better aircraft carriers, that much goes without saying. However, their surface escort consists, apart from cruisers and such like, of the four Kongo class, questionably called fast battleships, given their armour protection. Now, on the flip side, the British force consists of four of the R class, so not particularly modernised and significantly slower than the Kongos, but significantly heavier armed and vastly heavier armoured. On top of that, they also have the Warspite, which is that's already an ace in the hard just because Warspite. So, well, let's look at the two extreme scenarios to see what could happen. Okay, so extreme scenario one, if it comes down to a naval battle, is the Japanese aircraft actually managed to spot Somerville's forces early in the morning. They managed to survive any incoming fighters, and bear in mind the British ships do have air search radar, so they can see Japanese aircraft before the Japanese aircraft can see them, and normally would be able to deal with them. But let's assume for some reason that a Japanese aircraft gets through that, spots Somerville's forces, manages to leg it back to a point where it can tell Nagumo that this is where the British forces are, this is how much they number. In that case, it's probably going to be a complete disaster for the British, because 5 Japanese carriers are going to launch airstrikes. And in mid-1942, given the fact that Warspite is probably the only capital ship present that could be described as having anything like a half-decent AA suite, I don't see the British force lasting very long. Somerville's best bet is probably to then scatter and run to the four winds in the hopes that the Japanese aircraft can only find and sink some of his fleet. And if he doesn't make the right call, then probably the entire force is going to end up on the bottom, either through Japanese airstrikes or through follow-up Japanese surface attacks. So that's one extreme, Japanese victory, mainly through the use of air power. Conversely, the other extreme is that Somerville doesn't change course, and early that evening, as the sun is setting and carrier operations for the Japanese start to become difficult, he comes across Carrier Division 2, and bad things happen to Carrier Division 2. Now, if you want to go down this route where we're basically saying things just go horribly wrong for the Japanese as opposed to the previous one where everything goes horribly wrong for the British, you would then have the ships trying to send signals back to Nagumo to tell him what's going on, and Nagumo presumably responding to that, possibly even also sending aircraft, which gives Somerville a bearing on the Japanese Carrier Division 1 and the accompanying Kongos. And at this point it gets very interesting, because although the air crews available to the British are not their absolute top-rated ones, the British do have a little bit of a secret weapon in that they have radar-equipped torpedo strike bombers, and therefore the ability to find targets and attack them at night. Something they'd already demonstrated during the attack on Bismarck by HMS Victorious. So again, if we're putting everything in terms of things going right on the side of the British, if Somerville has a bearing and then launches as many torpedo bombers as he can possibly get airborne, fair enough, they are only albacores, but a radar-equipped albacores with a decent bearing, they find the Japanese fleet by radar at night when the Japanese can't operate combat air patrol, and Japanese anti-aircraft fire, which is pretty terrible at the best of times, is going to be pretty much hopeless when they're trying to pick up individual aircraft in the middle of the night with searchlights. And best case scenario, the albacores put a bunch of torpedoes into the Japanese carriers. Whether or not they put torpedoes into the Kongos is neither here nor there, to be particularly honest. But they're also then obviously able to report back the position of Nagumo's forces to Somerville. Somerville then closes in with the R-class and Warspite, at which point the Japanese have a choice. They can't operate aircraft. They can either withdraw the Kongos and try to keep them around to fight another day, at which point 5 British battleships fall on the remaining Japanese carriers like the fist of an angry god. see what happened to the Italian cruisers at Cape Matapan for what happens to them. Alternatively, you have 4 Kongos without radar, albeit with Japanese training in night fighting, versus 5 British battleships, which are, say, significantly better armed and armoured than they are. The Kongo's speed advantage doesn't mean as much because they're pinned in place trying to defend the carriers, and the British are able to use radar to see through the night. The British, again, probably repeat something like Cape Matapan, maybe not quite managing to close to such the same range, but that battle probably starts with every searchlight in the British fleet coming on all of a sudden at what for a battleship is probably a point blank to short range engagement. And then you find out what's that, 8 by 5, so you find out what 40 15-inch guns will do to a Kongo class with its minimally upgraded belt armor. And then they fall on the carriers. So, yeah. Extremes of the situation, either pretty much the whole British fleet ends up at the bottom, or quite possibly a hilarious number of the Japanese fleet ends up at the bottom, albeit, of course, there would be a whole bunch of cruisers fighting out and torpedoes and long-lance Japanese torpedoes crisscrossing the night, so who knows what could have happened. A balance of that, obviously, possibly being that Somerville engages Carrier Division 2, sinks both of them, decides not to push his luck and makes his way away using the rest of the cover of night, but because of the time he spent engaging Carrier Division 2, doesn't quite get away far enough and loses a ship or two to long-range Japanese airstrikes in the morning. So there you go. Take it or leave it, whichever particular scenario you prefer. I honestly couldn't roll the dice and tell you which was going to happen, but to be honest, the way things tended to fall in World War II, with things either going horribly right or horribly wrong for one side or the other, either of the options or something in between is entirely possible. Identifies as BC asks, how would the Yamato have fared in the 3rd and 4th battles of Savo Island if she had sortied instead of the Kongos? Significantly better, one suspects, although it's questionable as to whether she would have survived the entire encounter. So the first encounter, on the night of the 13th, that's going to go significantly better for the Japanese. The damage that caused them to lose Hiei probably isn't going to affect Yamato, if Yamato's in its place. And, if Yamato takes Hiei's place and just sails through the American forces, guns and searchlights blazing in all directions, that is going to do a tremendous amount of damage to everybody in question, both through the fact that, an 18-inch shell is going to do a hell of a lot more damage than the 14-inch shell, but also Yamato's secondary battery, and to be honest, the ranges they were fighting and the ships they were fighting, even anti-aircraft battery, is going to be able to put out a lot more firepower than a Kongo class's batteries could do. As a result, she's probably going to come out of it without the damage that crippled Hiei and left her vulnerable to air attack, which means that, she's probably going to escape severe damage during the air attack that followed in the morning. She might take a hit or two, but as we saw with how much effort it took to sink her, that's probably not going to trouble her too much if it's just 1 or 2 hits. So I think, yes, she would be able to sortie again on the 14th. However, this does rather affect things. I mean, the thing with these kind of alternate histories is it always kind of assumes that the enemy forces are going to remain the same, whereas I'm pretty sure if the US Navy had been told that there was a Yamato class floating around, they probably would have committed forces other than what they historically committed to the second night. However, since that butterflies in so many different directions, if we assume for a minute that for whatever reason they think, 2 battleships can handle the Yamato, maybe they rely on the inaccurate information where they think that Yamato is probably just a slightly heavier version of South Dakota, and they deploy South Dakota and Washington, and assuming as per your full question that the events pan out as normal with short circuits, etc., South Dakota is probably one very, very dead battleship. With all her major systems out of action because of an electrical fault, at point-blank range to a Yamato, I can't really see the South Dakota walking away from that, I'm afraid. 14-inch shells South Dakota's armor can protect itself from 18-inch shells, not so much. However, I don't think that Yamato is necessarily leaving this fight alive, because if we are assuming that everything's going as per normal, or as per historical, then that means Washington creeps up and starts unleashing hell with its 16-inch guns at very short range as well. Now, obviously, Yamato is in a significantly better position armor-wise to try and resist some of this incoming fire, and it's a much, much bigger ship, which means that even if its armor isn't capable of keeping out the Washington's fire completely, then it's still able to absorb hits much better, which means that unlike Hiroshima, which basically went, what the, oh, ow, 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 stop it, stop it, stop it, ow, glug, Yamato will probably survive long enough to turn its guns around and start firing back. Of course, you could end up with a kind of last Battle of the Bismarck situation where something really important like the bridge or fire control gets wiped out by one of Washington's hits, but let's flip a coin and take your chances. Whether a badly mauled Yamato can then fight the Washington into a mutual kill, it's entirely possible. I mean, of the two ships the US historically deployed, Washington is significantly less well protected than South Dakota, and as we said, South Dakota isn't going to survive a close-range encounter with Yamato on its own with all its guns not working. So it would come down to how much damage can Washington pump into Yamato to disable its ability to fight before Yamato turns its main battery around and unleashes all hell on Washington, because once that happens, again, I don't think Washington is making it out of there. Definitely not intact, quite probably not at all. But I think there's a very strong chance it could give Yamato enough of a mauling that Yamato is either going to go down because of it, or is going to be badly crippled enough that it can't get out of there soon enough, and American forces, be they surface or air, possibly even submarine, catch up to it relatively soon and just batter it into submission over the course of several hours during the following day. So all in all, it would be a lot worse for the US Navy, but statistically speaking, there's probably a fairly reasonable chance that they take Yamato down in direct surface action, one way or another, which would be a rather glorious episode to add to the US Navy's annals. Paul from Chicago asks, Mahan or Mahan, can somebody tell me how the heck that is pronounced? It can go either way in my mind. States rather emphatically that commerce raiding cannot win a war. Germany made a good try of it during the World Wars, but clearly didn't win. Yeah, no wonder. Can commerce raiding SSNs win wars today? I think I'm going to say a qualified yes, but it depends on what you mean by winning a war, and also, to be honest, with whom. Because the one difference between commerce raiding back when Mahan was writing, and even World War I and World War II, is that modern merchant shipping is concentrated in significantly fewer and much larger vessels. So the number of targets you need to go after is significantly less, and for all the size and power of something like the United States Navy, they still don't have anywhere near the number of ships that would be required to run convoy escorts on everything. Sure, you could run a convoy with a limited protection from a US Navy destroyer, or in maybe 10 years down the line, one of the FFGXs. But every ship you devote to that is a ship you're taking away from your carrier battle groups, and this assumes that you're going to war with America anyway. If you're not going to war with America, then I don't think there's any navy on the planet that could find anywhere near enough warships to escort the merchant vessels that might be heading into that country's territory. So, ironically enough, we're probably going to be, for most wars, you're probably going to be looking at a situation where you can run convoys, but all that's going to do is provide a target-rich environment, because you're probably not going to have the escorts around available to keep them safe. So individual ships proceeding is going to be the order of the day, most likely, because at least you're scattering the targets around. Unfortunately, compared to, again, World War I and World War II, a commerce raiding nuclear submarine can move significantly faster than the vast majority of merchant ships. So it's not a case of the merchant ships outrunning or bypassing a submarine. The submarine can run down the merchants. And with the modern economy tied into so many key factors and so much global trade being the lifeblood of most countries, a few nuclear submarines against most countries probably could shut down their economies quite quickly and severely. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about something like a landlocked country, there's not a lot you can do against its merchant trade because it's not going to have merchant trade going directly to its ports. That you can have merchants who are heading to other neutral countries' ports, and you can't attack them unless you want to be fighting everybody at once. But assuming that you are fighting a coastal nation with a coast, yeah, you're not going to win by physically beating them. And even a country like the UK has too many options with things like air travel these days to go to be completely starved into submission. Yeah, I mean, maybe you could probably starve something like Iceland into submission, but at that you would, in order to do it in a reasonable amount of time, you would have to also interdict the air routes, which a nuclear submarine's not necessarily the best at doing. But in terms of making a country put its hands up and go, actually, you know what, that we can't actually sustain this, and we're going to come to terms. Yes, a nuclear submarine force could do that completely, because yeah, although I say you probably would be hard pressed to actually starve a country out completely, you would be able to wreck their economy like you wouldn't believe. I mean, just hit the oil imports, and that's most private transport shut down, that's most industrial transport shut down, there's probably a lot of countries' power supply shut down as well. And with all that gone, well, emergency generators run on diesel. There's only so many strategic reserves a country can have, so yeah, if it's a coastal nation that doesn't have access to significant land-based oil transporting infrastructure, nuclear submarines just targeting oil and petroleum product deliveries is going to wreck a country to the point it's going to beg for mercy pretty soon. And that's before you get into attacking other things. And the other thing to bear in mind is that these days, with relatively few merchant ships on the high seas compared to the early part of the 20th century, and insurance rates going through the roof, and crews being somewhat more diverse than they used to be, once ships start going down that are heading for your target country, a lot of other ships are just going to turn around and say, no, we're not going. We'd rather go find somewhere else with other paying customers that don't involve us being blown out of the water. So, yeah, win a war? Absolutely no. Win a war as in force the other country to come to terms favourable to you? Almost certainly, barring either, as I say, barring either attacking a purely land-based country, somewhere like Russia that can just go, I don't care, I've got more than enough land space to do whatever I need to do, or maybe somewhere like the USA, although nuclear submarines being commerce raiding, unable to win a war against the USA, isn't necessarily to do with their lack of ability to cripple the USA's economy through sinking ships. It's more to do with the fact that the US Navy's far larger nuclear submarine force is probably going to hunt you down and sink you before you get a chance to do so. And yeah, like half a dozen super carriers blowing the ever-living daylights out of your own country and probably forcing them to terms before you manage to sink enough oil tankers and passenger ships to make the USA take notice of you. And that brings us to the end of the question and answer session for this truncated episode of the Drydock. Again, apologies for not being able to offer a full episode. However, at the time that I've got to this stage of the recording, I have about 2 to 3 hours before I need to go to sleep and then wake up at stupid o'clock to start the drive to Tankfest. So, with that said, there is one other item of business to deal with, and that is the ship design competition that we held at the beginning of, well, a month before this one. So with regards to that, obviously we have announced the 3 winners of the actual battleship design contest, but so many of you, because I did say you could design under that weight limit, sent in quite a variety of interesting designs for supercruisers, cruisers, and battle cruisers that I think probably worth a good consideration, and so I've created secondary prizes arbitrarily because I can for those entries. Now, for those of you who just created, well, I say just, those of you who created cruiser designs, don't worry, I haven't ignored you. However, unfortunately, there weren't enough of them for there to be a fair field for me to actually shortlist. So I've kept those aside as sort of future prospective entries into a design competition where at some point we actually get to design cruisers, but that's not for the minute. So we're just going to go over the winners of the subcategories from this last design competition, and then at the end of this I will announce the start of the next design competition. Hopefully I will bring out a how to spring shop video at some point in July. This competition will run from the time that you hear this, at the end of June. Final dates for entry will be the end of the first week in August, with winners, etc., announced at the end of August. So these competitions, I've decided they're going to have to be bi-monthly just to save my sanity and give me enough time to judge the entries. So with that said, let's get on to the other winners. So the first subcategory that made sense to create was the battlecruiser-other capital ship below 45,000 ton category. So for this one, we have 3 winners, as per normal. The first winner being the Salamis. And no, it didn't get not finished and then left in a dry dock. This one actually got built. So I'll just read the brief description that was provided with that. So it says, budget build for the Greek Navy in the early 1930s to counter the Turkish refit of Yavuz Sultan Selim and declining the building holiday offered by the Greeks. Financially, it assumes that Greece won its suit with AG Vulcan over the original Salamis and leveraged it as a down payment for British companies to finish its construction. Because of Greece's limited strategic goals and lack of a colonial empire, the main threat is the Turkish Yavuz Sultan Selim, the French Courbets and Britannias, the Italian dreadnoughts, especially the Andrea Doria class, naval sea mines, and Italian Mars boats. So the torpedo protection has extra emphasis, as well as a heavy main armour belt to resist newer French and Italian battleships' 15-inch guns. Although good luck resisting a Littoria's 15-inch guns with, well, anything, to be honest. The class would be built as a pair of ships, which were intentionally not built to maximum to allow the underfunded Greek Navy room to add future equipment without sacrificing still useful equipment on the ship. It's 613 feet long to edge out the Yavuz for national pride reasons, well, because of course it is, as well as to facilitate a higher top speed. It uses a mixed power plant with 70% coal due to Greece's limited oil reserves, and it generates a 28-knot top speed that will be acceptable to match Yavuz and give an advantage over all but the newest French and Italian ships. The main battery is 4X King George V of the 1914 class 13 and Iron Duke turrets, that's 13.5-inch guns, placed wholly onto the vessel. The secondary battery is 4 Leander-type main gun turrets, that's twin 6-inch guns, with 2 per side on the main deck to decrease topside weight and make the ship look a bit like a bigger and meaner Georgios Averof. The anti-aircraft battery is 5 British octuple pom-poms and 6 French 13.2mm quad machine gun mounts. Well, yeah, it is what it is. So yes, its main armour belt is 13.5 inches. Armour is described 8 13.5-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, fairly standard super firing pair arrangement. It has the 8 6-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 40 40mm guns, 24 13.2mm guns, and top speed of 28 knots as said. So came in as a pretty solid design. Overall displacement 28,743 tons standard. Just say for what it is, it's a pretty solid design. It's a relatively fast, mildly lightly armed, but fairly well-armoured capital ship, and for the opponents that it's going to be facing in the 1920s in the Mediterranean, not bad by at all. And most importantly, in terms of being a balanced design, it didn't roll over, sink, stress itself in high seas, or try to be a submarine. So that's entry number 1. Next up, we have the battle cruiser USS Constitution. This is a ship of just about 31,500 tons standard displacement, and in some ways resembles a slightly enlarged Alaska class. So it has 9 14-inch guns in 3 triple turrets laid out in the pattern traditionally used by modern US fast battleships. It has 16 5-inch guns in 8 twin mounts, 4 on each side, and it has 24 1.1-inch guns in 6 quad mounts. That's a nice historical touch for the 1930s. And 36 50 caliber machine guns in twin mounts. Again, nice historical touch for the 1930s. It has a 12-inch thick main armor belt. It is capable of 32.5 knots. And according to the calculations, it has excellent machinery storage and compartmentalization space, excellent accommodation and workspace, and is nice and strong. So yeah, it's a pretty nice, solid design. Kind of basically like the Alaskas, but with 2 inches extra on the caliber and a little bit, and a little bit more on the displacement. And yeah, it works. I can see it being a pretty nice, solid design. I mean, you could even guess with the triple 14-inch 50 caliber guns, you might even steal a few off of the standards, I suppose, but probably best to make new ones. Possibly a little bit of overkill for a cruiser killer, but hence why it's a battle cruiser. And will it stand up to other capital ships? Well, with a 15-degree angled 12-inch belt, you could argue it's got similar protection to a South Dakota. And yeah, I'd take it quite happily up against a Japanese Kongo class. Give it good odds fighting a Scharnhorst. Wouldn't necessarily want to take it up against something really heavy like a Yamato, obviously, but yeah, it's a good solid battlecruiser design. Nothing particularly wrong with it, and hence why it's also a winner. And lastly, we have the Japanese battlecruiser Takatsuma. It's the heaviest of the 3 sub-45,000 ton entries at 40,600 tons standard displacement. And boy, does it mount a bit of a beast of firepower. It carries 10 410mm or 16.1-inch guns in, well, 5 twin mounts, 3 of which are forward and 2 of which are aft. So imagine a Megami except on steroids in terms of gun layout. Its secondary battery consists of 25-inch guns in 10 twin mounts, possibly looking a little bit optimistically forward, but I guess they could be the 5-inch guns of the Fubuki class, which they wouldn't be completely out of the question, and 56 40mm anti-aircraft guns. I can understand the natural aversion to the Japanese 25mm, possibly slightly cheating a little bit there, but never mind. The main armor belt is 16 inches thick, so quite where someone gets off calling this a battle cruiser, I'm not entirely sure, given that it is it's better protected than all Japanese battleships bar Yamato. Belt is relatively shallow, albeit it's inclined at 15 degrees, so somewhat akin to HMS Nelson's, and its machinery allows it to travel at 31 knots. So, believe it or not, it does actually work. It has all been properly spec'd with the correct weights for engines, correct weights for guns and their ammunition. So it's quite the impressive achievement, actually. Pretty strong composite strength, actually slightly above 1. It's considered to have adequate machinery and storage compartmentalization space, excellent accommodation and workspace room. it is quite the beast of the seas. And so yeah, plus points for going with a very Japanese main turret layout, minus points for potentially slightly trying to avoid the plague that is the Japanese 25mm. Now, the next category was the cruiser killer category, or super heavy cruiser, whatever you want to call it. So in this category, the three winners were as follows. We first have HMCS, His Majesty's Canadian ship Charybdis, helpfully provided with a lovely little write-up here. So, Doctrine says, according to the recent construction of due to the recent construction of many increasingly large and dangerous types of cruisers by potentially hostile nations, such as the Hipper and Deutschland classes of the Kriegsmarine, the Megami Takao classes of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the Zara class cruisers of the Italian Navy, it was decided that two large and heavily armed cruisers are to be built according to Article 4, Subcategory 3 and 4 of the recently signed Second London Naval Treaty. Two ships of 17,500 tons standard displacement are to be constructed and operated by the Royal Canadian Navy and Royal Australian Navy, with personnel from both navies and the Royal Navy making up the complement of both ships. Due to the exposed nature of both Australia and Canada to Japanese and German raiders and cruisers in time of war, it was decided that both nations will each fund a single ship to be laid down in sea service with either their respective navies or the Royal Navy in the various theatres. In order to make space for two such ships, it's been decided to cancel one of the laid down hulls of the King George V class battleships, provisionally HMS Jellicoe, in order to facilitate prompt and punctual construction of these vital warships. Slips required will be freed or otherwise procured in order to bring these ships into service, featuring a design speed of 32.5 knots, a main battery of 8 modern 12-inch guns, and armour capable of withstanding 8-inch fire. These large cruisers will be able to combat any newly constructed light or heavy cruisers in the world, along with having the potential to briefly engage larger warships such as the Scharnhorst or Kongo classes. However, as it is to be stressed, this ship is far more of a cruiser than a capital ship and should be treated as such. These ships also have the flexibility to lead cruiser and destroyer squadrons, alongside providing heavy fleet anti-aircraft fire, making this class extremely versatile. So the ship has an appropriately long range of 12,000 nautical miles at 15 knots, with a top speed of 32.5 knots, which is obviously very good for operating in the Pacific Ocean or on long Atlantic cruises, hunting down raiders. The armament is made up, as it says, of 8 12-inch guns. However, this is in a slightly unusual layout, albeit that there's not a particularly massive design lineage of Australian or Canadian capital ships to draw on, so you can't really ding it for going against those lineages. And that is with 2 super-firing turrets forward and 1 aft, with the lower turrets, A and Y, being triples, and B turret being a twin. So you have 6 guns in 2 triple turrets and a single twin, making up the total of 8. It uses the 4-inch 45 caliber gun in its secondary battery to provide anti-aircraft and limited degree of anti-surface firepower, and a light anti-aircraft armament consisting of 4 octuple 2-pounder or 40mm mounts, for 32 guns, placed in a layout of 2 of these octuple mounts per side, along with 2 quadruple 21-inch torpedo launchers, 1 on each side as well, which will help it take part in torpedo attacks, scuttle enemy warships that have been crippled by its gunfire, etc. So this is all pretty good, solid design work. The vertical protection is a 5.5-inch thick belt over the machinery that tapers down. The magazines have an increased thickness of 6.5 inches, and there is a 3-inch going down to 2-inch thick deck, which provides pretty decent armour protection. The 2 ships, obviously HMCS Charybdis and HMAS Scylla, so I guess those names aren't going into the Dido class anytime soon, and it has a cross-deck catapult with seaplanes, which again, nice touch and very appropriate for the period. I particularly like this design as, yeah, it's definitely not a battle cruiser. It's not trying to be a battle cruiser. It's not even trying to stand up to other super cruisers. You might say overall that might be considered a design flaw, but it is very fitting to the 1930s where everyone was building super cruisers to counter everybody else's treaty cruisers, and this is exactly what it is. It doesn't use all that much of anything in terms of technically future vision. So yeah, for the Australians and Canadians, a good flagship, and a good way of dealing with enemy raiders. Not necessarily sure the Royal Navy would cancel King George V for it, but the ship works. It's seaworthy, solid, nice design. Next up, we have the Kingdom class battlecruiser, a 26,566 ton battlecruiser designed for the Royal Navy, and this ship's armament and layout shows a slightly different design philosophy to the Charybdis. Obviously, it's significantly heavier, but it's designed in the late 1930s as a counter to the growing threat of Japanese expansionism. So this ship's armament is 9 12-inch guns in the more traditional 3 triple turrets, 2 forward, obviously in a firing pair, and 1 aft. It carries a secondary battery of 6 5.25-inch guns in single mounts on either side, evenly spread. So 5.25-inch, yep, good. Single mounts, well, the British did historically like the twin, so I think if you're going to go with 6 of them, you maybe want 1 turret per side and 1 in a superfiring position over the aft, but that's just my comment. 32 40mm pom-pom barrels in in 4 quad mounts, so that's not too bad at all. Again, historical kind of armament. Its main belt is 12 inches thick and is inclined at a slight angle of 8 degrees. Slightly shallow belt, but that's typical for a battlecruiser. The machinery allows it to move at 33 knots, and according to the wonderful world of Spring Shop, it's very survivable. 48 12-inch hits to put it down. I guess that's down to the 12-inch slightly angled armor belt. It has a catapult for an aircraft, which is very important, obviously, and it's considered to have excellent machinery storage and compartmentalization, excellent accommodation workspace, a slow, easy roll, it's a good steady gun platform, a good seaboat, and rides out the heavy weather easily. So yes, as compared to Charybdis and Scylla, this ship uses its additional weight to provide itself with a slightly better anti-aircraft battery, but primarily significantly heavier armor. So this is sort of perhaps a later era supercruiser or cruiser killer, more along the lines of what the Japanese eventually tried to take their B-64s towards, or something more like the Stalingrads, as opposed to something like the early B-64 or Alaska designs. Lastly, in this category of cruiser killers, the heaviest of them all at 29,950 tons standard displacement is the De Zeven Provinciën. Hopefully I got that slightly better than I did pronounce that last time. A battlecruiser of the Netherlands laid down at the end of the 1930s. It should come as very little surprise to those of you who are aware of the 1047 design or the Dutch Navy in general that it's heavily inspired by that particular vessel. However, its armament is somewhat different. So we have 8 13-inch guns in 2 quad mounts forward. So French Richelieu style at that point, and possibly with that particular caliber, maybe even with design work taken from the French rather than the Germans, which, okay, it's not necessarily strictly historical, but as the entry says, what if they'd look towards France for inspiration? And, well, yep, that's a very French design. 1220mm guns in 6 twin mounts, 3 per side, the aft, make up the secondary battery, and 20 40mm guns in twin mounts make up the anti-aircraft battery. Its main belt is just under 9 inches thick and is inclined, if my maths is correct, by 18 degrees. It's capable with its machinery of going at 32 knots, and it is considered to have excellent machinery, storage and compartmentalization, excellent accommodation and workspace. Composite strength comes in nicely at a precise 1.0. So, yeah, again, pretty nice, solid design there. It's got a pretty nice armored deck as well. And yeah, for a French-inspired battle cruiser, well, if you look at something like the Dunkirk or the Strasbourg, you can definitely see a near direct influence. Um, and we are looking at a ship that would be pretty capable. I mean, with that kind of armor, I wouldn't necessarily like to take up against the Kongos. Then again, the Kongos armor is probably not going to offer fantastically more protection against it. And so, as a cruiser killer for operating in the Far East, well, Dunkirk and Strasbourg were pretty much designed as that. This is a slightly better version of them. It seems perfectly reasonable and adequate for the job, so that ship takes third place. So finally, we have 6 designs which were not necessarily bad designs, but they had some highly amusing feature to them that I thought was worthy of a mention, and specifically thanks to one of our very generous viewers, name in the description of the video, who donated a number of rather interesting prizes, which we shall describe momentarily. So we have, first up, we have this design. So the first ship is the IJN Hizen, an Japanese Imperial strike battleship of 45,000 tons displacement. However, it is, should we say, rather unique. It's very Japanese turned up to 11. Its main armament is only 6 16-inch guns in 3 twin mounts, all in the front. So you might be wondering, okay, so we've got an all-up front ship like Nelson or Dunkirk or Richelieu, but only 6 guns at the front. So what's hiding at the back? Well, yeah, what is hiding at the back? It's got a 155mm secondary battery, quite an extensive one actually. It's got a fairly heavy anti-aircraft battery, but that's not the important thing. Oh, no, 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 no. The important thing is it is a battleship, and in the very Japanese style, it's armed with torpedoes. Lots of torpedoes. Many, many, many torpedoes. It has no less than 10 sets of quadruple 24-inch long-lance torpedo launchers mounted all along the stern and along the sides with reloads. Because of course it is. I mean, sure, yeah, having 80 oxygen-fueled long lances on the deck of a battleship is surely never going to have any bad consequences whatsoever to anyone. Said nobody ever. Anyway, it's a very Japanese design, I'll give you that. For obvious survivability reasons, I could not really be given any kind of prize in a battle line. However, this ship receives the IGN Most Honourable Combat Award. So that is the prize awarded is a framed image of IGN Most Honourable Combat as taken from our April Fool's video for services in dedication, in honour of the dedication to close range combat presented by this vessel. So yeah, that's a good one. Also receiving the IJN Most Honourable Combat Melee Award is the USS Not Enough Firepower 1942 refit, a battleship laid down in 1939, which comes in at a mere 62,000 ton standard displacement and is armed with 9 18-inch guns, 24 5-inch guns, 40 40mm guns, 50 20mm guns, with a 90-degree inclined 14-inch thick armour belt and a top speed of 32.5 knots. So you might think, yeah, that's a very American level of firepower, but that's not the thing that is the reason that this ship gets the award. The reason this ship gets the award is because the way it's been designed, not only can it survive 34 18-inch shell hits coming in, its composite strength, which is obviously a measure of how well the ship is going to hold up, is 1.41. Now, for those of you who know how Spring Sharp works, you're probably head desking right now at how hilariously overbuilt this ship is. But for those of you who aren't familiar completely with Spring Sharp's analysis, a composite strength of 1.41 is approximately the same. Well, if you imagine a ship, shall we say, as a metallic shell, travelling through the water. A composite strength of 1.41 is more like a metallic brick travelling through the water. Yeah, no wonder it can survive nearly 3 dozen 18-inch shell hits. This thing is basically 2 slabs of steel with people running around inside the middle. It is going to survive to get into combat, and what is more, when it gets into combat, it is going to ram you, and it is going to run you down, and it is going to sink you, and at the worst, they're going to have to repaint the bow. That's how that's the level of composite strength this thing has, and this amuses me greatly. The idea of madly charging around 30+ knot Yamato scale behemoth, wildly firing guns in all directions, and then just cleaving through ships with a shark's face painted on the bow. It's a classic sight in my mind, and definitely worthy of the Most Honourable Combat Award. Next up, we have the design unnamed but happily labelled SCB-72, and this particular ship drew my attention because it's a 45,000 ton standard design, so exactly within the purview of the competition. Its armour belt is 16 inches thick, 19 degrees inclined. Its top speed is 30 knots. So far, so normal for kind of a 45,000 ton heavily armed fast battleship. However, the armament, and yes, this was submitted for the American Navy by an American, yes, the armament of this ship, if we ignore the main battery of 9 16-inch guns for the minute, is a grand total of 164 anti-aircraft barrels. This is the single highest number of anti-aircraft barrels, and by broadside weight, the single heaviest anti-aircraft armament of any entry of this entire competition. Yeah, I think pretty much everybody but the engineering crew is going to be out on deck firing when this thing comes under air attack, and therefore it rates a similar frame picture, except this one is the USS Second Amendment Rights Award, helpfully captioned, the right to bear all the arms. Because yes, that. Well done. Wrap yourself in an American flag and hope a bald eagle lands on you tonight. As well as that, we have the rather wonderfully named USS Float and Shoot. No surprises for guessing what this particular vessel does. Now, this ship comes in at 37,300 tons standard displacement. It's much less well protected, with only an Iowa scale belt of 12 inches of armour inclined at 20 degrees, capable of 30 knots, so slightly slower than the Iowa. And the main armament consists of 6 18-inch guns in 3 twin mounts, and then it really gets going. There are 14 5-inch guns in twin mounts in various places, 16 40mm guns, 20 20mm guns, 50 50 caliber machine guns, and 12 21-inch torpedoes in 4 triple launchers, 1 on each side. So yes, yeah, it's a mind-boggling level of weaponry. Step right up, step right up. We have the massive Doom cannons. We have the long-range Daka cannons. We have the slightly shorter range but heavy Daka cannons. We have the medium Daka cannons. We have the spray and pray at everything in sight machine guns. And we're a battleship armed with torpedoes as well, because why not? There was some spare space and we'd run out of guns. Unsurprisingly, this is the other ship that gets the Second Amendment Rights Award. I do love these things. Unfortunately, the supply of pictures is limited, so please don't take this as license to send in absolutely ridiculous designs for this upcoming competition, because unfortunately I don't have any more. So, for those of you who are keeping count, that leaves only one ship from the April Fool's video. Yes, HMS by Jove. And yeah, so we're on to the 2 that get those awards. So you're probably wondering what's going on there. Well, one of the winners of the HMS by Jove award for interesting ship design is the Caledonian-class battlecruiser, a 35,000-ton standard displacement battlecruiser of the Royal Navy. It's built somewhat like an enlarged Renown-class or battlecruiser, so it carries 6 16-inch guns in 2 twin mounts, pair superfiring forward and 1 aft. Its anti-aircraft battery consists of 16 40mm pom-poms in 4 quad mounts and 30 20mm cannon in 15 twin mounts. So we're thinking so far so good. Sounds like a fairly sensible larger Renown, I guess. Main belt is just under 12 inches thick, capable of 30 knots, all so far so good. And then we get to the secondary battery. For this ship carries 14 6-inch guns in hull-mounted casemates. Okay, well, you might think, okay, fine. It's older, maybe an older design inspiration. Don't know quite what the casemates are doing in the 1930s. But it also carries 21 4-inch guns in dual-purpose triple mounts, 7 of them. So yes, it has both casemate and deck-mounted secondary batteries. 2 separate secondary batteries. That's a lot of secondary battery guns. I mean, you've kind of created a really fast, really heavily armed battle cruiser pre-dreadnought concept. We've got 5 different calibers of guns on board. It's a sound design overall. I mean, I can't fault its composite strength, its speed, its range, or its armor protection for a battle cruiser at least. But yeah, oh, and of course, can't forget the 4 submerged stern torpedoes. You've got to have some torpedoes in there as well. Why there's submerged tubes mounted in the stern, I don't know, but yeah. So for reinventing the pre-dreadnought concept, this ship is definitely awarded the By Jove Award for interesting ship design. And lastly, the other winner of the By Jove Award for interesting ship design is the IJN Senjo. And what is that, you think? Is it another madcap battlecruiser battleship design? Well, no, this is actually quite the small vessel. It's only 7,700 tons standard displacement, so what makes it so unique? Well, to summarise the words of the gentleman who sent it in, it's basically a case of the Japanese taking an Alba-class cruiser hull, taking away all of the armament and torpedoes, and then cramming as many Type 89 5-inch guns as you can on it without tipping it over. Oh, and also it has to be very fast. So this ship is capable of 34 knots. Its armor belt is just under 4 inches thick. They apparently stuck 8 long lances in 2-quad launchers back on for whatever reason. But its main armament is no less than 14 5-inch guns and 8 25mm guns, because I guess someone has to get punishment duty. So yeah. 14 5-inch guns in twin mounts and a couple of single mounts. It is very, very Atlanta-like. That's a lot of mounts. 5 twin mounts, 4 singles on an Alba-size hull, plus torpedoes, plus 25s. Yep. The best part about this for me was that when I was just playing around with the speed and everything, it turns out that performance-wise, it is relatively strong and stable. There's that phrase again. Oh dear. At high speed, but when you start dropping the speed down, it becomes hilariously unstable. So not only have we managed to create a Japanese version of the Atlanta, we've managed to create a Japanese version of the Atlanta that not only can travel very fast, it must travel very fast. Because if it stops travelling very fast, it's going to roll over and sink. This may be something to do with the fact that its length to beam ratio is 10.31 to 1, so effectively it's a heavily armed knife um, going at high speed through the water. I love this concept. It's a thoroughly it's a, it's a yeah. It's not going to work at normal fleet cruising speeds. But the idea of a heavily armed anti-aircraft ship spitting fire and charging around at full pelt in the middle of a battle, purely because it can't actually slow down, is very hilarious to me. So, yep, a very good winner of the By Jove Award for Interesting Ship Design as well. And that, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully has brought this actually slightly longer than average episode of the Drydock, albeit with significantly fewer questions answered, unfortunately, to hopefully a rather amusing conclusion. Thank you very much for listening, except for one thing, the competition that's coming up. So the next competition is going to be as follows. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to design a battle cruiser. But not just any battle cruiser. No, no, no. You see, the year is 1907. People are just becoming aware of what HMS Invincible, so thoroughly inappropriately named, is actually equipped with. Whilst the German Navy is quietly trying to hide Blücher behind a 20,000-ton displacement couch, everyone else, including the other half of the German Navy, is trying to come up with a response to the Invincible. Your job is to choose a nation, and within the appropriate design constraints, dockyard size, etc., of that nation, come up with a response to HMS Invincible, the world's first battlecruiser. And if you're designing for the British, no, that doesn't mean you just get to throw in the HMS Inflexible and say, oh, but it's historical. No, 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 no. Obviously, you have to improve as well. The restrictions, as I said, is whatever nation you choose, you have to abide by that nation's 1907-1908 historical naval design restrictions in terms of dockyard space, turret layout, operation, etc., available gun caliber and such. Additionally, there is a weight restriction. You can build, given that the Invincibles are about 17,000 tons normal displacement, you can make a response that ranges from anything from 2,000 tons below to 3,000 tons above. So your normal displacement limit is between 15 and 20,000 tons, because bear in mind standard displacement hasn't been invented yet. So there you go, a period-accurate 1907-1908 battlecruiser designed in response to the Invincibles. Weight limit of between 15 and 20,000 tons normal displacement. And of course, the Invincibles are going to be its main opponent, at least as far as judging criteria goes. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Email as normal at 5minuteguides@gmail.com. And thank you very much for listening. I now have 2 hours to prepare for Tankfest. Why do I do this to myself? I hope to see some of you at Tankfest. And, yeah, see you in a little bit.